one of the first things that will happen is that the media will come under sort of martial law rules, which will probably put a great deal of solemn music on it and colonels reading out the news, rather as it happens in every other country when there's a coup.
The media manipulation we see happening now in Thailand is almost certain to continue, regardless of who's in power. It'll just be, a difference of which party's being censored, sort of the reds or the yellows.
That is because in this battle of wills on the streets of Bangkok, this media war, the winners will get to write the history. And long before that, they will get to broadcast the history, their version of it, as it happens. Here's how our Global Village Voices see the coverage of the protests in Thailand.
The problem in covering Thailand's political crisis is it has been going on for years now. There are so many layers to this issue, it is impossible to explain in just a few minutes. It is more than just red versus yellow. The coverage in Thailand has been unbalanced, to say the least. The state media is partly to be blamed for this escalation because they're uncritically parroting everything what the government is saying. No wonder the Reds and the Yellows have their own media outlets to show their side, and only their side, of what they think is the truth. Even though we have a diversity of opinions, we do not have full freedom of expression.
Media is the key factors of the conflicts. We also accelerate and make it worse by forgetting or ignoring our basic role, which are to investigate and present the facts by balancing from multiple perspectives, especially from the angles of subordinate groups. There is not enough space for the views and voice of villagers who are the majority of the protesters.
We're always looking for new Global Village Voices, people with an interesting take on the media. The best way to get on our air is through Facebook and Twitter. Just go to those sites and look for the Listening Post page there. We will let you know what stories we're working on so you can weigh in with an opinion on the coverage. Or you can reach us through email at listeningpost@aljazeera.net. Still in Southeast Asia, our News Bite section starts with a legal development in the Philippines. Two prominent politicians accused of the biggest mass murder of journalists in history have had charges against them dropped. 57 people were killed, more than 30 of them journalists, last November in the province of Maguindanao. Both Zalday Ampuatan, a former governor of Muslim Mindanao, and his uncle, a former mayor, have been cleared in the case. 4 other members of the same family still face charges. Prosecutors have said that there was a political motive behind the decision. Presidential elections are coming up next month. The Filipino Department of Justice denies that, arguing the legal case against the men was weak and that having the same family name does not establish a conspiracy. Journalists in Iran are still feeling the effects of the government's media crackdown after last year's disputed presidential election. Mohammad Nourizad, a prominent journalist and filmmaker, has been sentenced to 3.5 years in prison, as well as 50 lashes for distributing propaganda and desecrating the image of the Islamic Republic. Nourizad was arrested after writing a letter critical of Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, that urged Khamenei to apologize for the government's conduct in the aftermath of the elections. More than 120 journalists, bloggers, and political activists have been jailed for their part in the protests. Some of them have been sentenced to death. There is a campaign underway in Israel to get a banned newspaper report published, since it may shed light on the government's decision to launch last year's war on Gaza. The article was written by Yuri Blau, a reporter for the Haaretz newspaper. Blau has a track record of embarrassing the Israeli military through his reporting. Blau has been in hiding, reportedly in the UK, for the past 4 months in order to avoid being arrested and forced to hand in classified documents to Shin Bet, the Israeli secret police. Now, an Arab-Israeli member of parliament, Hanin Zubi, has tabled a question in the Knesset to Ehud Barak, the defense minister, demanding to know why the publication of Blau's article was banned. This is a sensitive issue in Israel. The government had a legal injunction in place against not just the article, but against reporting that the article existed. That was before that injunction was thrown out by a judge. That volcano in Iceland put a stop to most air traffic across Europe, but it did manage to boost web traffic. Stranded would-be travelers turned to social media sites to help get them moving. On Twitter, for example, there was a group called Get Me Home and another called Put Me Up, pretty self-explanatory. And on Facebook, there was another group set up called Carpool Europe. It is not entirely clear how effective these sites were. One user was quoted as saying, "Twitter was no help at all unless it's the thought that counts." We're back after the break with a piece on the media angle on the story of the coup in Kyrgyzstan. Welcome back. Earlier this month, protesters on the streets of Kyrgyzstan's capital, Bishkek, overthrew President Kurmanbek Bakiev. This was a case of history repeating itself, and more quickly than it usually does. It was only 5 years ago that Bakiev came to power, riding the same kind of street demonstrations that just cost him his job. In another parallel to the 2005 coup, among the first governmental institutions that the coup leaders targeted were state-controlled radio and television. The protesters, more than 80 of whom were killed, saw the broadcasters as mouthpieces for a corrupt president. But will the new government allow Kyrgyz media any more leeway to report real news as opposed to propaganda than its predecessor did? According to the Listening Post's Simon Ostrovsky, who filed this report from Bishkek, the answer to that question is not yet.
Bishkek. It's the morning after 2 days of protests and rioting turned parts of the Kyrgyzstan capital into little more than smoldering debris. But it's not just a few government buildings that have had a violent makeover. Kyrgyzstan's news airwaves have changed too. This is Kyrgyzstan's main state-owned media company, and when unrest broke out in Bishkek, it was one of the first buildings that rioters and protesters attacked. The opposition in Kyrgyzstan very quickly understood that if they wanted to control the country, they had to control the airwaves.
Ну, что мы видели с окна, это то, что пришла группа людей, в основном это молодые люди были, в возрасте, может, 20 лет. Его начали сразу ломить, все ломать подряд.
We were really not sure if this mass of people could actually be safe.
The rampaging protesters came as a shock to the employees of the state media company. But critics of the regime it served said staff members shouldn't have been surprised they were a target because the channel was seen as the deposed president's mouthpiece. Kurmanbek Bakiev came to power in 2005 using protests much like the ones that deposed him this month. He promised sweeping reforms, but instead used his position to enrich himself and his family. In his final days in office, he used his powers to try to silence his critics in the media.
К сожалению, я лишь об